guys, it's me again. So I'm going to do a screencast here for parts of Chapter 9. We're going to talk some about 9 in class, and then there's going to be this for parts of it. So I just wanted to show you the little starting thing here. And we're going to talk about Piaget and theory in class. So I am going to do the screencast on Vygotsky and language. Those are the two things I'm going to talk about here. So we have for cognitive theorists, there's actually 3 that the book discusses. There's Piaget, Vygotsky, and then information processing. Now, keep in mind all of these things, the whole basis of cognitive theory is curiosity and discussion about how we know what we know, how we learn. So they just look at things differently, and I've said this before, but Piaget, sort of on an overall basis, comes from the idea, if you can remember this kind of little thing, development precedes learning. So development first, and then learning. That the brain, that we have to have the capacity to learn certain things. We must be ready for it internally, neurologically, before we can learn it. And then, of course, there's a feedback loop in that. Once we've reached development, the environment, we learn from the environment, and then the environment creates our development. So there's a feedback loop. So that's Piaget, and we'll talk a little bit about him in class. Vygotsky is another, information processing we keep kind of sticking in as we go. And it is just sort of the modern cognitive theory that uses technology as a way to look at how children learn. And using some of these, like Piaget and Vygotsky, as sort of the ground zero. And then starting from there to look at, okay, are these right? How do we know? What can we learn specifically using the technologies that we have, fMRIs, and different types of research and testing, modern types, to determine, like for babies even, there's something called habituation. And if a baby, and habituation is basically when you learn through habituation, you bore a baby and see what they know. So for example, they see a circle, a circle, a circle. At first it's novel, it's new, it's exciting. They show interest in that. And over time they get bored of it because they know it. Like any of us, right? And so then you give them a triangle. And then you can measure the changes in their physiology, their facial expressions, all of these things to determine, okay, they realize this is something new and novel. And so habituation is a process of, within information processing, that tests sort of babies' learning. So, but then we have Vygotsky. Excuse me. And we're really just starting to talk about him more because I said this early on in what we were doing. I'm going to pause for just a second because I need water. And I'm back. So Vygotsky, as opposed to Piaget, remember this, Piaget, learning precedes, comes before, development precedes learning. That's Piaget. Development comes before learning. Vygotsky is learning precedes development. Learning comes before development. So they're kind of working in alternate loops here in what they saw. So this is just going to talk a little bit about some of Vygotsky's big terms. He comes into discussion a lot more when we start talking about children going to school and learning, more so than babies, because a lot of his stuff is still used in education. So Vygotsky emphasized early thinking is shaped by, there should be other, people's wishes and goals. Children are apprentices in thinking. We've talked about that before. So just like you might be an apprentice in any kind of work that you might do, that we might do, apprentice counselors, apprentice nurses, whatever, if we go and learn a skill. Children are in general, according to him, apprentices in thinking. They're learning from their culture, from the elders in their culture, how to think, and through their culture and their society. So children are curious and observant. They require mentors to present challenges, offer assistance, add information, and encourage motivation. So people in their environment, and they can be other children as well, especially for some social learning, for some skill building, as they're, you might hear my husband sneezing, as they're motor skills are growing. Children like in sports and so forth can be mentors and build things in them as well. Guided participation is a big Vygotsky idea here. It's the idea that we learn from others not by just telling them stuff, but by showing them kinesthetically, learning through them. So they are participants in the learning, but with assistance and support mechanisms in place. So children, they learn to tie their shoes by somebody kind of doing it with them and showing them how it works while they're participating in the process. You can't just show it to them and have them then, they got mirror neurons going, but it's kind of hard then for them to just do it. They, little by little, become more and more participators in the process, but they're given that opportunity. So guided participation. Zone of proximal development, we've talked about this before, big Vygotsky concept. So we want to teach children at that perfect place where they are not too challenged to be frustrated or under challenged so that they're bored. So it has to be that place where they can learn with some assistance and guidance and not yet independently, because at that point they become bored. So that's kind of a fine line that we want to find. Scaffolding, you'll still hear in education a lot. Just think of a scaffold, right? When we're building a building, a scaffold is that thing that sort of holds everything up until it's ready to stand on its own. So same for children in learning, that we give them scaffolds through guided participation until they can stand on their own. So if we're until I teach my son to make himself macaroni and cheese. So step by step, I help him. We turn on the water. I have to show him the pot and how to turn the oven on, and then he does it. And all these little steps, and I'm going to guide him through that and scaffold his learning, showing him how to do that until little by little I can say, well, you do this part on your own. Okay, and then I might help him here, and then you do this part on your own. So we scaffold based on their needs and abilities, and so that they can master each new step. Okay, so you can just see that visually as a scaffold helping them learn. So language, we talk about language. Vygotsky believed language was essential to the development of thought. So it talks about two different kinds. So private speech is the internal dialogue that we get. Now, I think what's really kind of cute and interesting in this is that little children will talk to themselves all the time. And this is very healthy because it's sort of how they come to understand the world. They explain things to themselves. Blah, 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 blah. My son still does it. He's 10. Blah, 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 blah. And I can hear him in the shower sometimes just talking through things and telling himself stuff. And children do that all the time. And that's how they develop new ideas and solve their problems. They talk them through to themselves. Now, as we get older and society tells us we should not talk to ourselves in public, we get a little bit older and then we start to kind of whisper. We start to sort of, it's all going on inside of our heads, but we still have this private speech. But little kids, this 2 to 6 time frame, will do it out loud, right? And this is how they're solving problems. So then language learning, if we go back to like language theories and how language is learned, and sociocultural theory would say we actually are driven to learn language because we are social creatures and we want to interact with people. So that it mediates our social environment. And as we are more with people and they are speaking and we want to be a part of that emotionally, that and then we see that we want to be heard and we want to express ourselves, that children learn through this language and through this give and take, serve and return of language. And so it's a very important concept within Vygotsky, that it is a tool for learning and a very important one. So let's look at language in general. I don't know why it says Ben King in there. Let's get rid of that. Okay. So early childhood is a sensitive period. It's not a critical period, but it is a very sensitive period. It's easiest to learn to master vocabulary, grammar, and all of that, pronunciation. In early childhood, this 2 to 6 time period. Average child knows about 500 words at 2 and more than 10,000 at 6. So think about that. That's a huge jump between 2 to 6. So after 2, we begin seeing a really quick learning of vocabulary. And so how does, then and grammar comes online more into and as children start talking in language more and they start putting little sentences together. And what I have found, and I truly believe, is that a lot of grammar and language learning is very auditory in general. And when I was teaching English to high school students, what I found was it's really hard to unlearn grammar rules that one has for themselves because it's been based on what they've heard their whole lives. So if they hear in their homes incorrect grammar, I ain't gonna do nothing, then that sounds right to them. That to them, they really, that's the grammar that they have learned. That's the structure of it. That seems correct. And so to learn something different is not correct. So the way that language is used to them is so important, and they hear it over and over again. And all of that, comes in, and they learn this between 2 to 6 very, very strongly. Overregulation, we all know this in children. So children learn that plural, they listen to language, they learn that plurals have an S on the end. And then you ask them, so there's a mouse and there's a second mouse. What do we call them? And they might say mouses, because they are using the rules that they know incorrectly because they have to be taught the exceptions to the rules. And so that's overregulation. And these little kids, and it's so cute when they do it, they do this a lot, right? And they haven't learned the word mouses from adults because hopefully we don't say that. So they're actually creating those words in their heads based on rules that they have heard. So there's a lot of learning and there's a lot of stuff going on in this time period. I'm going to switch these two. So let's talk about fast mapping for a second, because this is part of how it's believed that children learn language. After this 2 mark especially, because they can seem to learn a word with just one, research has been done on this, with just one exposure to it. And a lot of this has to do with context. So for example, if you remember the Bobo Kiki experiment for synesthesia, if I had put on the board a triangle and a circle, and I showed a child this, and they knew triangle and circle, and then I drew like the Bobo shape, the big round shape, and I said, okay, can you please point to the Bobo? So they will assume that's the Bobo because they know what the circle, through context they learn the word and they know it. So fast mapping has 2 sort of areas in it. One is how they learn the word in the context, and the second might be how they retain it, and there's not as much research done on how the retention of it. A little bit. We're not going to get deeply into that. But they can be forgotten without repetition and some kind of remembering. So the first research in this was done with, they would show children 2 trays. This was like in the 70s or something. 2 trays. One was blue, one was olive. And they said, so get me the chromium, which is the olive, the chromium tray, not the blue one. And children would go get the olive tray because they knew blue. So they fast map through context and through what's familiar to them, the schemas they already have, and then they can begin to see what doesn't fit into them and then create language out of that. So it's kind of interesting. It's very, very quick. We go from 500 to 10,000 in 4 years. So it might lend to that whole idea of the language acquisition device in our head. Like somehow we're set up neurologically to learn language and grammar and all of these things. So that's one of those theories. So the idea of bilingual, young children, of course, very sensitive period to learn 2 languages because, as we get older, children take in 2 different languages and they don't have separate areas for them as much when they're really little to learn this. As adults, why it's so hard is that we listen to it, have to translate it into our head, and then bring it out. Children, all of this is done kind of more automatically, no matter what the language is. So it's a really good sensitive period. That's why more and more, elementary schools and even preschools are having Spanish and other, language offerings and learnings. A balanced bilingual child is considered that they are fluent in 2 languages. They don't favor one over the other. They can do both, listen to both. It can be difficult for children, like first-generation children whose parents aren't balanced bilingual. They often become interpreters for their parents, which is a very, it's an interesting thing for these children culturally. But it's a beautiful thing to be this balanced bilingual, to know both easily. All right. So that's chapter 9, what we're not gonna do in class. I'll see you guys soon.